Today we will have some strange modifications of the T-34. I'll immediately point out that the information had to be pieced together literally bit by bit, and it's possible that some of it is incorrect. This is about a T-34 tank with a T-62 turret. These are actual photographs. Photo had the caption, "At first, I thought it was a website or blog mark, but in fact, it was a user from one of the Bulgarian forums who photographed the T-34. Now we have at least some information. The tank belonged to Bulgaria, and the Bulgarians were known to be fond of digging in tanks and turning them into fortifications. Further research led me to a modeling website forum, where a user named Cdoy described the process of creating a tank model and shared the information he had found. The story began in 1952, when the Turks decided to join NATO. The Bulgarians created the so-called Prince Mark Line along the border with Turkey, a network of defensive fortifications named after the hero of the Southern Slavic epic. This entire line was intended to hold back the enemy until the arrival of Allied forces. In addition to German T-4s, the Bulgarians also buried the turrets of Soviet T-34s, which by a certain point had become obsolete and were replaced with more modern tanks. Later, the Soviet Union supplied the Bulgarians with T-62 tanks, but these too were eventually decommissioned in the 1990s. Then came a very strange move. The Bulgarians removed 162 turrets and converted them into engineering vehicles. In place of the T-62 turret, they welded on half-shortened turrets, and the T-55s were equipped with an anti-aircraft machine gun. The vehicles were also equipped with winches and retained their underwater navigation equipment. But the most important thing is that the removed T-62 turrets were allegedly sent to the Arsenal plant in Kazanlak, where they were installed on the remaining T-34 hulls. However, to install such a colossus on the T-34, the hull had to be widened and additional plates welded on. After modifications, the vehicles were sent for installation on the defensive line. Any tank mobility was out of the question, as the hull would have to be extended by one road wheel. Overall, the T-34-62 turned out to be simply a T-34 hull with a T-62 turret installed, which nevertheless makes it a unique and very interesting piece of armament. This project was created back in the 1950s, specifically to post-war Czechoslovakia, where Skoda dreamed of creating its own anti-aircraft vehicle. Soviet influence grew, and ultimately, the decision was made to create anti-aircraft tanks based on the T-34-85. The new vehicle was supposed to provide armored units of T-34s with protection from air attacks. It could also be used against ground targets and infantry. The Czechs were notorious for inventing several options at once, so designs emerged for lightly and heavily armored vehicles. The former was required to withstand machine gun fire, while the latter could withstand light artillery or tank fire. Finally, the third variant was supposed to be a command vehicle for coordinating fire from other anti-aircraft guns. By July 1953, prototypes were undergoing field testing. The chassis proved to be successful, but problems arose with the armament. The hydraulic system too weak, the crew in the turret was cramped like sprats in tomato sauce. The turret itself was a huge problem, literally. Its size made the tank an excellent target, and the open cabin made it vulnerable to artillery and mortar fire. As a result, after testing, there was a long debate about whether to accept the vehicle or modify it, but ultimately, the project was abandoned. The Czechs did not stop. 2 years later, in 1955, work on the anti-aircraft tank resumed. The Czechs now planned to initially install the 7mm R10 cannon and later a modified version of the R12. The tank was designed with an unmanned turret, which was more than unusual for the time. The vehicle was named LP-157. The crew consisted of 3 people and was located in the tank's hull. They later decided that 1 gun was insufficient and 2 would be needed. This project was named LP-257. Ultimately, development of anti-aircraft tanks dragged on so long that another famous anti-aircraft gun, the Praga, was already accepted into service. Therefore, the promising Czech designs based on the T-34-85 remained unimplemented, although in some ways they were ahead of their time. Next up is an Egghead surprise from Yugoslavia. This tank was created as a result of the political crisis between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, which some even call Cold War. Indeed, the rift was not only political, but also economic, significantly undermining the prospects for the development of the Yugoslav armed forces. Meanwhile, the ambitions of the country's leadership were rapidly growing. Yugoslavia needed a new tank, and ultimately, the decision was made to copy the Soviet T-34-85. The choice of the T-34 was driven by the need to produce spare parts for existing tanks. Otherwise, the engineers were told to create and fix the shortcomings of the Soviet version. Work began in earnest, with engineers from various organizations and factories working on it. On June 16, 1949, a decision was made to create a pilot batch of 5 tanks. The plant was supposed to assemble 5 prototypes in less than a year. Various enterprises across the country worked on the new tank. One of the Soviet T-34s was completely disassembled for copying, as no blueprints were available, and tank parts were created based on the layout and overall concept. The tank was indistinguishable from the Soviet version. The surprise surprises were in the details. The tank's armor was reinforced and additional side armor plates were installed. The most significant changes were in the turret. It was taller and wider. The original armor was thicker, as required. The turret was supposed to withstand a direct hit from a ZS-3 cannon from 250 meters away. The sloped front reduced the area of the frontal surface, which should have reduced the likelihood of damage. The extension in the rear niche was intended to increase the ammunition capacity in the turret. The armament was also improved. The modernized Soviet gun was used as a basis, equipped with a muzzle brake. An electric drive was used for turret traverse. A Browning was mounted on the turret roof as a sight. Finally, the engineers designed their own modernized diesel transmission, also fine-tuned to their Yugoslavian specifications. They didn't forget to copy the rollers and tracks, although they turned out to be heavier than the Soviet ones. Following the testing results, the tank's turret was deemed a failure. The cruise field of view was reduced by 50% compared to Soviet tanks. The engine required modifications, and the tank was superior to the original in terms of armament and armor, but it was still inferior in maneuverability. On May 1st, 1950, the tanks participated in the Belgrade Parade, which surprised not only the citizens of Yugoslavia, but also military attaches from other countries. However, after the parade, 2 of the 5 tanks built were destroyed at the testing grounds. Only one example survived, the Egghead T-34, which never went into production. So, it was 1931. Production of the T-26 medium tank began in the Soviet Union. However, these vehicles were considered rather complex and expensive to produce, and the Red Army needed a cheaper and simpler second-tier backup tank. The mobilization tank was expected to weigh just over 4 tons, allowing for transport in the back of a truck. A 63-horsepower automobile engine was considered for the power plant, and the tank was planned to utilize a large number of automotive components. The first 2 prototypes were built by the end of 1932. The finished tank weighed 4,800 kilograms. The front and side armor was 10 millimeters thick and the roof was 6 millimeters thick. The front horizontal and lower vertical plates were slightly sloped. The driver was positioned on the left side of the front hull in a slightly forward armored cabin, designed to increase working space. The fighting compartment was located in the middle of the hull. The turret armor was still 10 millimeters thick. The engine was located in the rear of the tank for engine cooling. An air intake protected by an armored box was mounted on the roof of the engine transmission compartment. The vehicle's maximum speed was 45 kilometers per hour. Overall, both T-34 prototypes were similar, differing only in the lighting devices. During trials conducted in 1933, the T-34 mobilization tanks demonstrated good performance despite their weight exceeding the specified limits. Their speed and cross-country ability were on par with the production T-26, although their cruising range was only 180 kilometers. Among the most significant drawbacks, weak armament was noted. Alternatively, suggestions to rearm the tank with machine guns or small caliber cannons were considered. The first option was advantageous because it did not require modifications to the existing design, while installing a cannon would have required the creation of a new turret. However, the second option was chosen because the cannon's firepower was much higher. A specially designed cannon was chosen as the cannon. However, this artillery system was still in the development stage, so as not to waste time. A mock-up of the 20mm cannon was installed in a standard T-34 turret with an improvised box imitating the gun mantlet. The trials were successful, but they could not be recommended. Work on the T-34 ceased at the end of 1934. These vehicles have not survived to this day. Soviet machine gunners mounted on the armor of T-34s became a memorable and easily recognizable image online. Numerous photographs and videos of tank landings can be found, but the soldiers were exposed to risk in the event of a surprise attack, and Soviet engineers puzzled over how to protect the landing force. Since the T-34 became the most widely produced Soviet tank, was quite large, and had good cross-country speed, it was the tank most often used for landing. According to Yuri Pashalak, the Soviet Union tried to ensure at least a minimal level of comfort for landing troops. For example, in the spring of 1942, handrails were installed on T-34 tanks from plant number 112. In the fall, this innovation appeared on tanks from other factories as well, but the main issue was protecting the paratroopers and saving them from heavy enemy infantry fire. Various options were proposed, such as armored sleds in which paratroopers would travel behind a tank. A number of unusual ideas also existed, one of which was proposed by Major Kazimirov, senior inspector of tank troops at the political department of the 38th Army. Kazimirov proposed equipping the T-34 and KV-1 tanks with so-called armor pockets. He proposed placing the pockets not only in the rear, but also along the sides of the tank to avoid overloading them. The thickness of such pockets was to be 8 millimeters. While this would not protect against a tank shell, it would be sufficient to protect against enemy infantry fire. Kazimirov called the paratroopers an 8-man outer crew. The author's idea was for the outer crew to include 4 machine gunners and 4 submachine gunners, one of whom would carry an anti-tank rifle. One soldier would be stationed in each side pocket. The cells in this tank were open at the top and equipped with embrasures for firing at enemy infantry. However, the problem was pressing. If infantry abandoned the tank, the tank would remain virtually unprotected, with enemy infantry operating along its sides. If the density of enemy fire prevented effective combat, the external landing force could use grenades. According to Kazimirov's idea, each soldier was to be issued 10 grenades, 5 of which were anti-tank. Equip the T-34 tanks of the 96th Tank Brigade with these grenades and use them in combat. The command approved the idea, and Kazimirov described it in more detail, sending his findings to the Red Army's Gab 2. Kazimirov developed a special tactic for using tanks equipped with pockets. The combined use of several tanks allowed for a high density of fire, making it easy to suppress enemy infantry. Finally, Kazimirov proposed using airborne assault tanks at night, which would require 2 powerful headlights mounted in the rear to blind the enemy. Kazimirov sent all his ideas and developments to their designated locations, but never received a response. Kazimirov's tank pockets, fortunately or unfortunately, never went into production, but the inventor himself successfully completed the war and received numerous awards.